We're thrilled to welcome back two great friends of the show in Zavain Dar, partner at Lux Capital, and Nan Lee, managing director at Obvious Ventures. It's a pleasure to host you both again. Thanks for joining us today, and glad to have you help us kick off our inaugural episode of BIOS Roundtable, a new feature series going behind the scenes of life sciences innovation with world-leading experts. Here we'll debate the state of the industry, recent news, emerging trends, and think critically about the future that awaits us. To help host today's episode, I'm joined by my colleagues, Hamdi Chabusoglu and Chris Godbon. We're lucky today to feature on this episode two great friends who started their careers at the famed Innovation Endeavors and are now partners amongst two of the leading TechBio VCs. Without further ado, I'll let them introduce themselves. Let's kick things off. Zavain, can you share a brief intro with us?
Of course. Thanks for having us, Chaz. I'm Zavain. I'm a partner at Lux Capital, trained as a computer scientist, undergrad and graduate studies at Stanford. In the past, I've been a software engineer, a software entrepreneur. For the basketball fans out there, I've advised a few NBA teams on machine learning and Moneyball and analytics, which candidly actually informed a lot of how I think about integrating software and data science and machine learning into pharma and biotech. And after partnering with Nan at Innovation Endeavors for the last 8 years, I've been helping to lead the biotech franchise at Lux Capital. We are a full stack early stage and growth stage venture firm at this point. We invest across the lifetime, the continuum of the life cycle of early stage and late stage private companies. So anywhere from de novo company creation all the way up until through IPO and pre-IPO investing. About 50% of what we do is in and around healthcare and life sciences. And likewise, about 50% of what I do is in and around biotech in particular, especially kind of the intersection and integration of technology and automation into the life sciences and into biotech. The other 50% is broadly kind of machine learning enabled and deep tech companies. So anywhere from next gen manufacturing to natural language processing and computer vision. In and around biotech, I think we're fortunate to have built, I think, one of the leading portfolios, especially at this intersection, Chaz and Nan. I think Nan's done a phenomenally impressive job too, and I'd put our two portfolios neck to neck, which is great for the hopefully fisticuffs that we're about to have soon. And kind of highlights and investments that I'd call out just off the bat are Recursion, which we took public last year, Anagenex, Icon, which just today announced a 500 million plus Series B financing, which was actually co-founded by one of my partners and good friends, Adam Goldburn. And so that's kind of a little bit of a exemplar and a little bit of a taste of the sorts of investing and companies that we get excited about.
Fantastic. Thanks again for joining us, Zavain. Nan, can you share an intro as well?
Yeah, sure thing. Great to be back on the show, and thanks for everyone to bring us together here on video. So similar to Zav, my background is also coming at TechBio from the tech side. So I have a dual background in computer science and math, and have applied that into the field of venture capital for over a decade at this point. Mostly looking at frontier technologies applied into different industrial use cases, cross-pollinating the world of data science, ML, computer vision, robotics, what have you, into much needed unsolved problems across a number of different industries. I was really fortunate to be tapped to help launch Obvious Ventures back in 2014. We're a Silicon Valley-based venture fund with very much that mandate, which is to invest in applying all the great tools from Silicon Valley into really large unsolved problems in the core, call them non-digital sectors. So of course, with that mandate, healthcare and life science are case study number one of the largest opportunities that we can think of to apply these kinds of tools. So at this point, I would say over 50% of our portfolio sits either upstream in drug discovery, therapeutics, diagnostics, in the life science space, but also in clinical development and the operations of clinical trials, and then all the way downstream into patient-facing clinical care and looking at new models to deliver healthcare into patients. I've been spending the vast majority of my time in this area since around 2013 or so, looking at the explosion of bioinformatics and just the maturity of a few different tools coming together. I hope we get a chance to cover that yeah, I really believe it creates this generational opportunity to rethink drug discovery, development, every single stage, end to end in getting therapies to patients. And we've done a bunch of investing around that topic across different modalities: small molecule, antibody therapy, multi-specifics, gene therapy, cell therapy. And we have a pretty large portfolio here, and we're excited to only deepen down on our work here. And we see that to be a defining narrative for the work at Obvious as far forward as we can see.
Fantastic. Thanks again for you both joining us today. Excited to host you. And a little bit more about today's episode. We'll dive into topics that characterize the state of biotech entrepreneurship, the founder-led biotech movement today, biotech business model innovation, the climate of today's public and private markets, and so much more. I'll pass it off to Hamdi now to guide us through our first topic.
Thank you, Chaz, and Nan and Zavain. I'm excited to speak with you today. First up, I would like to get a little bit into this idea about founder-led biotechs. In 2021, we saw an impassioned back and forth between VCs and founders, especially on Twitter, debating the merits of this founder-friendly biotech movement or TechBio movement versus the traditional biotech venture creation routes that's been largely pioneered out of the kind of older school mentality of the 70s and 80s. Nan, first up for you, how's the shift towards platform companies and the rise of TechBio contributed to an emerging change in founder dynamics across this landscape?
Yeah, I think that's a great starting point. It's a lot to unpack here, but I think I would start with the recognition that I believe, and a number of other folks are starting to believe, that we're entering an era of platform bio. And I think that multi-asset, multi-program platform companies have been historically the exception to the rule in biotech. And if you think about companies like Moderna, those are very few and far between. And the vast majority of life science in terms of fundraising, deal making, have been focused on single asset or a handful of assets centered around a single biological hypothesis. The exception to that historically has been when entirely new modalities have been invented. So those are the opportunities to take a bundle of programs to market, because if you have a new therapeutic effect, you can try to perturb that in a number of different indications. But those are really rare. And I think that the era that we're moving into now in terms of the explosion of platform companies that you see are really a testament to how many new tools have come into the fold, both in terms of compute and also assaying, sequencing, and wet lab tools that are available to scientists. And the result of that is that a lot of companies can build these very intentional discovery engines that are looking to investigate a certain category of biology in a more thorough way. So I just think that you have to mark, if we're going to mark a timeline, 2020 circa today is a good inflection point to see the industry, at least on the startup side, start to make that transition in mass into a platform bio model. So then we have to think about what are the downstream implications of that model, and how does it affect the founding teams that tend to create companies and the sort of environmental context surrounding new upstarts. So if you think about that, there are a bunch of things that I would point out, and the first one is that biological discovery is now becoming more intentional, not fully causal, and I'm not trying to get into predictions around fully accurate in silico modeling, but just that these platforms are being architected in a very intentional way. They're being run, and we're relying on these platforms and the serendipity of their operations to create lots of interesting biological hypotheses that can be pushed downstream into development and translational medicine. So the first effect of that on the founder archetype is that founders are less so sort of scientists that have stumbled upon some sort of biological discovery while running a lab or serving as a postdoc, but they've intentionally architected a company from scratch. They've recruited the different functional leaders. They are the masterminds behind their companies. They are not the scientific founders that had a eureka moment. So that contrast starts to inform the importance, relative importance of these founders in the companies of yesterday and the companies of tomorrow. So founders will have more power when they are the masterminds of these platforms. So I think that's why you see a lot more founder centricity around how investors are flocking to these platform bio leaders, is that they're not a scientist that's working on a number of different projects, and one happens to, be ready for commercial efforts. They are painstakingly assembling the founding teams and designing the platforms, and there's I think a real importance to the founders of platform bio companies that single asset founders as part-time scientists didn't tend to have. And I think you start there, and that ripples into the role of those founders in assembling the early teams, how they interact with their early venture investors. So I think a lot of the founder centricity is not so much cultural or stylistic differences between East Coast and West Coast investors, if we were to boil it down to something simple like that. I think it's just that, at least for the investors, I would count Zav and myself as part of that cohort that really recognize the value of platform founders, is because their role has totally changed. The scientific founders of single asset companies, they rarely join companies full time in the first place, and they rarely are well situated to be the CEO or to really ride out the full company journey. But platform founders start their companies with more intentionality. They're not taking accidental discoveries and bringing them to a bio incubator or a venture fund to go see if there's something there. They know that there's something there. They're leading with their founder vision. So that, I think, it tends to mirror more of a tech founder archetype and how tech platforms are built.
I would caveat. I would say there's two things. One, I think Nan was 100% right in the distinction between a founder who maybe has a moment of eureka and unearths or discovers a biological hypothesis or an interesting, small molecule or antibody that may or may not perform, and then it's really about kind of the tacit and explicit steps of preclinical and clinical development to push that hypothesis forward, versus the sorts of founders that we're seeing today, which are very much so, as Nan alluded to, they may not even have an initial biological hypothesis or an initial kind of piece of composition of matter, but rather they have a platform that's attempting to mechanize, to some extent, biological discovery or the discovery of novel composition of matter to perturb biology in a particular way. And those two are very distinct, right? Historically, and especially over the last, I would say probably 2 to 2.5 decades, the latter really hasn't been funded by biotech. It's really only been the former. And when you think about, and it's not that traditional biotech, it's not that the Atlases and the Polarises of the world are irrational Luddites. They've performed exceptionally well, and they're all very, very, very intelligent. But the reality is, when you get a founder who has an interesting molecule, a postdoc, a PhD, a professor, or the same who has an interesting biological hypothesis about a mechanism or a target, they likely don't know how to run animal studies. They don't know what ADMA tox studies look like. They don't know how to run clinical studies, right? Clinical development studies. And by and large, especially over the history of biotech, that knowledge has been very, very, very opaque. It's been contained in the minds and the heads of a handful of industry stewards and a handful of large and small organizations. And I think one of the amazing things that's happening right now, akin to what happened to software and SaaS businesses in the early aughts, is you're starting to see the democratization of that knowledge. And that's both with folks like yourselves at BIOS and the incubators and the seed funds and the early stage venture firms that are all kind of enabling this and democratizing a lot of this knowledge. It's from BioTwit. Chaz, you mentioned the founder-led kind of versus investment firm incubated debates that were happening on Twitter. I think everybody learned from watching those, right? And the same way that maybe Paul Graham's blog in 2006 was kind of a central authority for educating young software entrepreneurs how to build these companies, we're seeing similar sorts of kind of knowledge repositories emerge. The last thing that'll add is that it's all additive. With every platform company that comes out, it's then useful or accessible or a service for the next company. And so if you're a first-time entrepreneur who's building an interesting platform that maybe has a unique way to build, let's call it AAVs, right? You may not know how to run animal studies, but there's likely a software company that can help outsource that for you at this point. A company that's likely been started in the last 10 years, that's likely run by someone who's tech forward and data progressive, right? And so you're starting to see the uncoupling of the stack, and I think you're going to see kind of startups and upstarts and service providers emerge at every one of those layers that historically had to be built vertically in-house, and that historically were only possible from industry gray hairs, so to speak.
Yeah, you're seeing a shift foundationally from a world where biological discovery are chance lightning events, and the lottery tickets are being scratched by a number of different scientists federated across the labs of the world. And then that's totally decoupled from development, which it's sort of this dark art that's also very network driven. It sits at these epicenters of capital. And then you're moving to a world where biological discovery can be engineered and designed for and architected, and the success and failure of the downstream development and commercial milestones, it really lands on the shoulders of the master architect, and that is the founder. And that's why there's this prominence and rise of the TechBio founder persona.
That's great. And actually kind of leads to this next question. I'll lead with you, Zav, so is this rift between, traditional venture creation versus inventor-led biotech kind of a false schism here? And is there really a place for both of them to kind of coexist in this ecosystem? As you mentioned, there's been this decoupling of stack, but then there's other plays there. They're trying to completely centralize everything else that they have. And what sort of circumstances do you think leads for this coexistence versus this other strategies people might be putting forward?
I think it's absolutely a false dichotomy. It's not at all zero sum. And hopefully, if Nan and I were cogent in our explanation on the first part, you can tell that it's really a difference between the sort of company and the sort of science and technology that's being commercialized. Is it a single kind of eureka moment, or is it a larger kind of platform that's attempting to mechanize a broader suite of problems? The former being something maybe that's better set up for a venture firm to kind of co-found or spin out, and the latter being something that likely a technological or entrepreneurial inventor founder will lead forward. I'll caveat that there are failure modes on both ends of the extremes, right? And I'll start off with maybe the more, at least for this audience, a little bit of the less popular failure mode, which is maybe the founder has hit their limit in terms of their ability to be a chief executive. And at that point, it's okay to have difficult conversations, but conversations that are really with the intent of kind of stewarding the potential of the platform or the science or the technology to its greatest possible instantiation, right? And those are difficult conversations, but we've certainly had those, and we'll only continue to have them. And the latter, the other end of the failure mode, the other side of the continuum here is oftentimes you'll see a lot of the kind of industry-leading venture investors, especially in biotech, meet amazing young entrepreneurial founders who have an interesting platform idea, and without it being necessary, they will try to force them out. Right? They'll say, "Oh, you're too young. You've never done this," and they won't take a moment to realize that this time is different for all of the reasons we alluded to, in the last 5 or 10 minutes. And so you want to have an open and agile mind. And I'll point to two of our highest performing and best companies, most exciting companies in the space, Icon and Recursion, as two companies that, Recursion, Chris Gibson, kind of founding CEO, still the CEO today, his first and only job out of academia, and he's been amazing. Icon just today announced 500 million plus in the Series B. We brought in a CEO, Roger Perlmutter, who formerly ran research at Merck. And so it's certainly not dogmatic. There's no only single solution, but it really is what's the right solution for the right company at the right stage that puts the platform and the science and the technology in position to maximize its potential.
That's great there, and actually leads to a great transition on, let's discuss a bit on the changing of today's biotech business models. Let's look a bit at how these platform companies are starting to integrate. So Nan, there have been many potential business models for platform companies today that people are exploring, be it partnerships, out-licensing services, in-licensing, repurposing of opportunities, spin-outs, and subsidiaries. How do companies navigate this? And is there an ideal mix? How does one opportunity kind of discover, their recipe, so to say?
Yeah, I like that list. Fairly comprehensive, and as you can see, really, really diverse. Someone should make a little 8-ball that you shake and one of those pops up. I think there'd be a bio
that's
CEO
not wholly
audience.
different than how we do it on a number of our boards.
But exactly to your point, we live in a world of opportunity in this field today that really didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago in terms of the different doors that are open to founders, even at the earliest of stages. And I would say that these playbooks are being written in real time. Icon, Recursion, Ginkgo, these companies are less than 10 years old, and they are forging an amazing path, and they're pioneers in this field. We're really fortunate to work with some of them directly, but the playbook is early. And I think right now we actually live in a time where it's more likely that their efforts are being misinterpreted as lessons by the founders of tomorrow than a clear blueprint emerging. And I find myself giving this advice to my own portfolio companies or other founders that I meet more often than not, which is you cannot think of it as there's an answer out there for you to discover, and you're going to grow your company through observing and then copying the business models of another company. The nuance is so important here. So the first thing I'd say is, I don't think that there's a correct answer that every founder should ascribe to. It's more around what are the limitations of the technology and IP that sits within my company? What are the external environmental contexts in my modality and what indications I'm going after? That should inform what options are the best ones, even amongst ones that are being offered. I'll try to make this clear as an example. If I have a single piece of IP that's a biological asset, a molecule that comes out of a lab, and I'm a single asset company, it is not in my best interest or my investor's best interest to sell that asset at preclinical and just exit, because then I'm left with no other IP, and that essentially shuts down the company. And that's why you see single asset companies really prioritizing and pushing clinical development, because they want to increase the value of their sole asset. They're not interested in out licensing early on or even partnerships. But if I work in a platform, if I'm building a platform bio company, and if it happens to be in a really interesting new modality where my IP and my capabilities start to resonate with large pharma companies, even ahead of my pipeline or any assets come maturing, then there may be really lucrative even in licensing or at least partnership co-development opportunities that come up, and that could be a really interesting path for those types of companies to take. I think the general rule that founders should follow is, what is the risk-adjusted value that I'm getting for each piece of IP that I have, whether it be individual assets and programs or if it's the platform itself. And I think the more the broader a platform is, the more founders can start to give up early program economics for early partnerships and learnings from pharma, or engaging and getting to some commercial milestone early. So I think that those are great options for platform companies that other sort of more narrowly defined pieces of IP shouldn't go after, because it would be sort of short-term greedy, short-term thinking.
Great, thank you for that. And Zav, how should companies navigate these changes, you think? Not only in their business models, but also in the investor landscape, be it this TechBio versus biotech builders, or this other analogy of East Coast versus West Coast that we brought up.
I'll maybe preface it with two pieces of context. One, I think capital markets largely surrounding biotech and life sciences today still values one thing and one thing only, which is IP on molecules. And ideally, the value of the IP on any individual molecule only increases the more mature it goes, kind of through the preclinical and clinical development pipeline. The other is that, especially with these emerging platform companies, the context today is very different than the context in 2014 or 2015, when there was so much, rightfully so, skepticism about, we've seen kind of CombiCamp before, or we've seen supercomputers thrown at genomics before, and it just hasn't worked out. At this point, I think the data and the results are undeniably true. And so I think the incremental skeptic is increasingly so at an accelerating pace being turned over into a believer. And so what that means is, in 2014 or 2015, I think a lot of these companies, they had to seek validation. And so whereas it maybe wasn't in the best interest of the business to partner with a larger biotech or a larger pharma company, they needed that validation to convince whatever investor they were seeking to kind of raise capital from. At this point, I think Nan and I likely both guide all of our companies to not partner unless it's on your strategic roadmap, unless it's additive to where you're going. If an investor comes to one of our companies and they say, we really like what you're doing, but man, I would feel a lot more confident with my LPs and with my other partners if there was a top 10 pharma who was partnering with you guys, that's probably not the right investor for our company, right? You want the investor to have conviction and confidence independent of what maybe the 30 brains in the top 10 pharma are thinking. And quite candidly, having had conversations and being friends with many of those executives at top pharma, they are probably 3 to 6 years behind where the cutting edge of actual science and technology are today. And I think that's being generous, maybe even more. I don't want to be too inflammatory on a public podcast, but I think
that's where the fisticuffs really are coming out right now.
Bring in Dean Lee here. But I do believe that's it's important to guide the company with a clear and cogent sense of where long-term strategic value will be created and how the company will capture that. And it's also similarly important to not mortgage the long-term value by trying to ascribe to an investor's insecurity by seeking a partnership that will take you off course or will be dilutive to your time or attention or bandwidth.
Yeah, I actually think that there's a time and a place for these kinds of partnerships, and they're not all created equal. I think some partnerships from pharma can be actually unnecessarily punitive. They're pushing companies into specific research directions, and they're very sort of low and upfront focus economics. These kind of transactional services partnerships are very distracting to most companies that want to build a platform. But I think that a lot of the new platform companies that come out, we talked about this earlier, they're formed without really strong target or biological hypotheses. It's more about the founders and the founding teams understand different components of technologies that they want to bring together, and the architecture is very clear. But then we say this phrase a lot, like, where are you pointing the engine? Like, where are we going? And that is more of an open question. So I think that partnerships up front can be almost this external CISO that pays you at its best. And getting into the sort of program prioritization org of these large pharma companies and borrowing their resources to tell you about new targets and priorities that can help inform our own pipeline, those are really interesting discussions to have. And even if you don't ink the deal on a partnership, if you have something of value in your platform and you're being invited into those discussions as a founder, I always think those are worthwhile to have, because you have a tremendous sort of brain trust across the table from you, and a lot of interesting, biological clinical direction can come out of those discussions that can help prioritize, pipeline development, and it's almost another scientific advisor that is in orbit of the company.
And I don't mean to be myopic that partnerships are always evil or in any way, shape, or form a necessary evil. We have a company, Adimab, in our portfolio that only does partnerships, and they have 100+ partnerships with 50+ biotechs and pharmas globally, and I think they're responsible for almost 10% of the clinical development antibodies right now, and so that's one example of one extreme of the business model. And quite frankly, especially for a lot of emerging biotech companies, especially these platform companies, they have more fruit than they can prosecute themselves, right? So oftentimes it's about saying, okay, man, maybe obesity or IBD is too large of a market for us to go after alone. The clinical trials there would be hundreds of millions, if not upwards of $500 million to run. We have to partner this unless we're going to go try to raise 750 million just to go after one asset, when in the background we have an entire platform that's spewing off other targets and indications and molecules for us to prosecute, right? And so there are kind of these moments in time where partnerships totally make sense. And the last one is also even just, especially I'm thinking about kind of younger founders who are doing these things for the first time, partnering to learn, right? Like, whereas we kind of scoff about maybe pharma is, 6 or 7 or whatever, a number of years behind in terms of the cutting edge of the science and the tech. The reality is they're really, really, really good at what they do, right? They're really good at clinical development and they're really good at commercialization. And if you can partner and if you can learn, then you do need to run the calculus, right? Get out the abacus and see, is it worth the trade-offs of what you're losing on your bandwidth and your time and your attention? But it's not always one way or another. And I really do think it takes nuanced and intellectually honest conversations from management and the board and investors.
That's great. And also a natural transition point. Chris, can you please take it away for our next part?
Thank you, Hamdi, and guests. So you mentioned, Zavain, earlier the public markets and capital markets, and I think that's something we want to target next. You said recently that in 2022, we'll see a heralding of never before seen dislocation between public and private markets as capital floods into private companies, increasing their valuations and minting unicorns and decacorns at a record rate that will result in the lowest number of IPOs in a decade. So, especially considering the fact that the number of biotech IPOs has just been increasing year over year, especially with the rise of SPACs and more biotech companies went public in 2021 than ever before. Can you talk to us a little bit more about those predictions?
Yeah, I'll caveat it with that was broadly tech and biotech. So especially kind of the increasing cadence of unicorns and decacorns, especially I don't know if there are today any existing private biotech decacorns. I might be missing one, but I don't think so. So that obviously will come more so from fintech or marketplaces or, God forbid, crypto. The life sciences aspect of this is Chris, you're absolutely right. The last, I think, probably 3 or 4 years, we've seen increasing number year on year of go public transactions, right? Whether that's an IPO, a SPAC, or whatever. And we've also seen an increasing number of M&A transactions until last year. And I think right around probably Q3 last year, that fell off a cliff. I suspect it's in one part because of interest rates, and especially with early stage biotech companies where really kind of the cash flows are 7, 8, 9, 10 years out. Any incremental change in interest rate is non-linear to the expected value of that cash flow. And so with respect to time out. And so that'll really hurt both kind of speculative tech companies, but then also biotech companies. There's a reason why I think at the end of the year, the XBI was down about 25% and the S&P was up 25%. So there was a 50% delta between tech and biotech, right? And there's a reason why for that. And it's not to say that there's any indictment on the fundamentals of the private and the public biotech companies over the last 2 quarters. It's not like suddenly every biotech company that's public on NASDAQ has suddenly lost 25% of the value. It's not like 25% of their assets failed. It's not like 25% of their teams left or their platform stopped working. It's truly just a macro issue. And I think what you're afforded at the private stage of investing is you're afforded to ignore as much as realistically plausible and possible the macro, because you're investing with a longer time horizon. You're investing 3, 4, 5, 6, up to 10 years out. And so I think what we're seeing is a recognition that there are these phenomenally kind of compounding exponential curves on both the molecular biology, the chemistry, the automation, the software, and the machine learning arcs. They're all integrating at once. And I think savvy investors are saying, okay, we want to put our capital there, but we don't want to be beholden to the whims of the macro. And so I do think, like, you look at the number of private investments in biotech that are over 100 or 150 or 200 million. 3 years ago, those used to be very rare. I think they used to be maybe 10 to 11 to 12 a year. I think last year there were probably upwards of 50 or so. I think that number will only continue to increase. And I do think that assuming that the macro doesn't immediately change, I think it's going to take a while for that to reboot. And so I think we're going to have a big gap between companies that raise large amounts of private capital with an eye not towards immediate liquidity, not towards a crossover and then an immediate IPO, but with an eye towards, hey, let's raise a large amount of capital And let's maybe push forward further than we would have otherwise. Let's push forward further than maybe 3 or 4 years ago when we would have felt like, hey, we have a phase 1 or phase 2 asset. Now it's the right time to IPO. It's okay to stay private and really kind of push your assets forward as long as you give yourself a chance to prove out both your pipeline and your platform without being beholden to the whims of the public market right now.
And actually, if you just look at that stat around the increasing round sizes and valuations in private markets across all of tech, and especially in these TechBio platforms, and you look at where the public markets are in terms of IPO listing and post-listing performance over the last 2-3 years in biotech, you start to see this rift. You see that private investors, and Icon's round announced today is a really great example of that. Those private investors are making a contrarian statement against public markets with that investment, because if they're looking for multiples on their capital on that round size, there's essentially no precedent in public markets today, no single example you can find that they could use as a comparable when projecting out future exits. So implicitly, what's being said with their checkbooks by a lot of private investors is that public markets are wrong, and they're putting their money where their mouth is in droves around that statement. And I think it goes back to the current sentiment around public markets, maybe driven by interest rates, and also just driven by the time and sort of friction that it takes to change consensus valuation in a new category. Is just going to be slower for public markets. And predominantly you see in the last 2-3 years of IPOs, especially in the Recursions and the Acceleras and the size of the world, if you read the analyst reports and you kind of look at where valuation sits in these companies, it tells you that the public markets predominantly are using NPV analysis of existing clinical pipeline on any company, regardless of what's under the hood, regardless of the IP or platform value or secret sauce. And I think that CEOs of those companies are frustrated that their pricing doesn't move, and they're continuing to announce amazing IP breakthroughs on the platform side. So I suspect that we're going to see that sentiment shift in public markets, but it's going to take longer. And I think that biotech founders are getting savvier and realizing that waiting for that new consensus to form across the democratic process of public market valuation is a slow and sort of difficult to forecast slog. And finding the right private capital to get a round done at the right pricing that reflects true long-term value is in a sense right now the more efficient of the two options.
And I think Nan's point there about the recursions, the abscis, the relays, the Schrodingers of the world today that are public, public markets largely are ascribing zero platform value, zero. And so they're basically saying, hey, throw away your platform. Let's take the IP on the molecules and let's just keep on pushing them forward. Let's assume you don't develop anything else. Let's assume all those scientists, all the data, all the automation, let's just throw it all out. And that's how we're going to value you today. And to be fair, historically, because as we started off this kind of debate talking about, historically it was really kind of one-off serendipity, moments of kind of eureka where companies were formed, and moments of eureka are not repeatable. So there was no platform inherently, right? You can't rely on, oh, I'll have another moment where I discover the next E equals MC squared kind of moment. That's just not a thing. And so, I think it will take time. It will happen inevitably if we're right. And God, there's totally a world where we're just totally wrong, and like none of these things play out. But there's also a world where over time, the relays, the Schrodingers, the Recursions, the abscis, that name your publicly traded kind of comp bio or tech plus bio company today, where they show increased efficacy through the clinic. They show an increased cadence of assets through IND into the clinic. Right. And if they can show those two over time, it'll become undeniable, and you will start to see value accruing back to the platform. I think the second vintage of companies, the companies that have maybe been able to observe the Recursions and the relays and the Schrodingers from the sidelines, and they're maybe 2 or 3 years behind, are asking themselves, wait, why go public and force myself through that kind of song and dance for public market investors who won't understand and won't care to understand about what I'm doing, when I can stay private, especially now more than ever, where there's more private capital available than ever before in the history of capital markets. And so like it's the only tension will be at what point do shareholders and management and comment seek liquidity. But even that, I think, is being solved for.
It's actually really interesting because we're in an era right now where there's, by some definition, more overlap between public and private markets than ever in terms of funds that play across the spectrum and play a crossover into publics. Venture funds are holding their positions and becoming public market investors. A lot of hedge funds are crossing over into privates, even early stage privates. So there is this blending, and I think to a founder that can be confusing to think about this as a sort of undifferentiated continuum between early stage private all the way to public. But from where I sit, I see the biggest rift across public and private now than ever because of the underwriting primitives that go into public market biotechs versus privates. And ultimately, to a founder, they have to sign up for a public market valuation and underwriting model that's driven by consensus. So you have to wait for the average of the industry to move to the new truth. And in private markets, valuation and investor behavior is driven by exception. So that even if no private investors believe, except for one, your deal is going to get done and your valuation is going to get sort of upgraded to the at least mutually correct level between one investor and a founder. And that's just a lot easier to navigate. And you start to see that behavior play out across the sort of icons and these larger private rounds, the Adamabs of the world. And I think for later stage companies in biotech, that should be very appealing versus the IPO route.
I know we could dive into this further, but in the interest of time, I'm going to pass it back to Hamdi for our new topic, rapid fire, the 7x7, overrated and underrated.
Thank you, Chris. So, in this sort of section, based off of Tyler Cohen and many others who go off on the idea, I'm going to quickly prompt you with a phrase and ask you, is it overrated or underrated? And very quickly, tell me why. So first off, tech in bio. Nan, please take it away first. And then Zav.
Underrated. There's a lot of enthusiasm for the category, but we're still in such early innings. I think technological tools making their way into bio are, first of all, only exist in a very small fraction of biotechs overall and large pharma companies. So we're in the early chapters of that growth. And I think we're already seeing how this combination bears fruit. And this is going to be a huge narrative for the next decade.
Zav?
There are a few things I believe more that it's underrated. The confluence of integrating technology and automation, data science and ML into the life sciences is so powerful. And you're seeing it anywhere from DeepMind and AlphaFold to all of the companies that we've mentioned and listed today. There are just so few people today who are sufficiently fluent or conversant in chemistry, biology, preclinical drug discovery, clinical drug development, automation, software, machine learning. There's hundreds, not thousands of those people in the world out there. And so if you're one of them, you are sitting at the nexus of what I think will be one of the dominant themes over the next decade.
West Coast investors in bio, overrated, underrated? Zav, do you want to start this one?
I think properly rated. I'll take the even there. Like on one hand, like my excitement about integrating technology into the life sciences, I don't think can be overstated. On the other hand, I think that especially technology investors who don't take the time to actually understand the nuances of biotech and life sciences, they can get in over their heads and they can lead companies the wrong way, and they can actually, I think, put entrepreneurs and really promising platforms at risk by overcapitalizing or overpricing or any of these, other things we've spoken about. So, I think the skepticism from probably the East Coast investors is valid, but I think the optimism of what is possible if you get this right is equally valid. So it's properly rated today.
I would go overrated, and I'm interpreting West Coast investors as generalist tech VCs making their way into bio, and there are more firms than ever now. I think what we found out, and Zav and I started on the tech side as well, moving into the space, and we've been here for almost a decade, and we've seen that it's a pretty steep learning curve that we're still climbing every day So I just think that this space is not for a tourist tech VC that wants to make investments and start making Airbnb platform analogies. Those don't totally hold. This is a niche industry. It takes a ton of prior experience, and being a student of history, I think everyone has something to learn in this space. So that's the opportunity, between tech and bio and the green field of the combination. But I think that it takes wholehearted attention to do this well. And it's something that I think unless a firm really mobilizes around and puts effort behind, they're going to be very distracting to founders and very poor investors over a long period of time.
And none, how about platform companies?
I go underrated. We're still in the early era of multi-asset discovery companies. I think with all the tools that are maturing all at the same time, we're in this perfect storm of our ability to measure, investigate, model out biology, getting clearer, sharper, higher resolution, cheaper every single day. So that will result in a lot more platform companies in the future than even the examples and case studies that we have today.
Although underrated, I think that the next decade will usher in 5 to 15, 100 billion plus outcomes from companies that today are 3 years old or younger, and call it 5 years old and younger. Let's give it a little bit more of a window. But I do think that will happen, and the confluence of the technologies and the sciences are so powerful. We'll have multiple, Moderna-like outcomes here. I think on an expected value basis, we're probably properly rated, and that there's going to be a lot of huge blowups. These companies are so hard to build, and you really need to kind of capitalize them and steward them and guide them in the right ways. And so we're going to have huge blowups and a ton of skeletons too. And I worry about, will the skeletons scare away future capital? And so I think we all here have a responsibility to build these companies carefully and well. But I think if we do it right, it's wildly underrated.
Synthetic biology?
Underrated. Underrated with the caveat that I'm not always sure I know what synthetic biology means. It is because in a lot of ways it's just molecular biology with kind of like gene editing and recombinant DNA. But the potential of that kind of science is thus far, I think, very much so underrealized and underappreciated. And especially as we get more data, and especially as we integrate more automation and software into these processes and workflows, I think it's only going to show increased efficacy and applicability, not just in healthcare, candidly, but broadly across industry.
Whoever worked their branding magic to turn crypto into Web3 needs to be working on SynBio. Because I do think that the new tools in editing biology make the next era of SynBio a totally different chapter than previous attempts at SynBio. And I think the word and the industry carry a lot of baggage and weight from prior attempts. So I do think it's vastly underrated and likely not getting enough spotlight. I think there's a lot of attention around sequencing tech and discovery platforms, but our ability to custom edit, the genome and make custom cell lines and treat biology as sort of a products business is only going to grow in the next 5-10 years, and I think it's going to be a huge resurgence in SynBio.
John Doerr is right now sending an email to the Amorous board, trying to change the name to Bio 5. That's the new name. So.
Bio 3. You heard it here first.
Here we go.
I love that. And on that thought, tool companies like Berkeley Lights, Twist, and 10X.
I feel like I'm picking on them, but I would go overrated. I think that they've been the subject of a lot of scrutiny recently because as a tools company, you have only a certain period of time where your approach is novel. So you have this kind of erosion of IP and commoditization chasing you, no matter sort of what tool and where you sit in the infrastructure stack. I think every tools company has a period of explosion where there's this sort of differentiation. They can command partnership royalties and maybe premium pricing, but then it erodes over time. So I think all of them will have to reinvent themselves as discovery companies, and many of them are. But it's very challenging. I think they're great businesses. I just don't think that they're going to be one of the $100 billion outcomes that we're looking at here as a platform.
I'll go the opposite here. I think they're underrated. I'm broadly convinced that value in drug discovery and development will flip-flop over the next decade. So whereas today the vast majority of value is on the clinical dev side, I think as these platforms prove to be increasingly efficacious, value will pull back to the discovery side. And if you think about just how early these companies are, the Berkeley Lights, the Twists, the 10x Genomics, of the Adaptives of the world, they're so early in terms of integrating across the entirety of the industry, especially on the drug development side. And so two things will happen. One, the drug development side will increase in value and command a premium. Two, these technologies and these toolkits will become increasingly so difficult to ignore. The fact that like large pharma still today doesn't know what Berkeley Lights is, and I know there's so many short reports on it that like they've struggled operationally, but not from a science or technology basis, right? And none of these companies have. Like what they're doing is truly transformative. And 10 years from now, there's no way a top 30 pharma won't know about these companies.
I know it's a broad one, but cell and gene therapy. Zavain, you want to kick this one off?
I think overrated. Just yeah, God, maybe inflammatory to say, maybe controversial. The sciences and the technologies are so cool and beautiful and exquisite. I think the vast majority of the gene and the cell therapy therapeutics platforms, I suspect over time will be replaced with exogenous molecules, so antibodies, mAbs, small molecules. And so I think there's a moment in time where they're, especially given the emergence of kind of genomic-led target discovery, they're very appropriate right now. Long term, will they be the easiest way to cure a patient for that particular disease? I'm less so convinced. And I think markets will incentivize an easier delivery system.
I think we should have you back and do a whole episode on that topic. Sorry, no, please.
I think I'm much more bullish than Zav is here, because I think a lot of that is anchored on current sort of the current state of technology around those modalities, and there's a ton of great work being done around manufacturing and delivery to unblock some of those problems. So I'm very bullish on them, especially if you look at the development pipeline against those modalities, how many phase 2, phase 3 projects there are. And in terms of what modality is most likely to make us a big splash in the next decade going into commercial, it's going to be cell and gene therapy.
Great. And finally, Ginkgo Bioworks, underrated or overrated? Nan, take it away.
I default to overrated. I haven't checked their market cap recently, but just at that, you can't go the under at you can't go the over at that price. So I think it's a great business, and you know they have their hand in many pots and all of that. I think SynBio needs the leadership of the next generation, so I root for every company. But at sort of this expectation of market cap, I would go under.
I'll go underrated. Which I guess is the opposite of Nan's position. I just think Jason Kelly's done such a phenomenal job recruiting, building, evangelizing, and finding investors who are comfortable with him taking a sufficiently long J curve to actually bring this business to fruition. So I think he's still in the midst of that J curve, which is why a lot of, especially more recent public market investors who maybe aren't as familiar with the technology or the path or the vision are skeptical. It doesn't look and feel like anything we've seen before. But I think if he's right, it's going to be massively, massively, massively right. And he's done such a phenomenal job of stocking his cap table with patient investors who are giving him the leash to actually go and execute against the vision.
Great. Thank you for all this. And to wrap things up, I would like to pass it over to Chaz.
Thank you both once again for joining us today. It's been a phenomenal episode, and could not ask for two better guests for our inaugural episode here today. As we wrap up today, any closing thoughts you'd like to share with our audience, Nan?
No, I think, you know, despite some minor differences, you're hearing from two sort of, you know, over the moon bulls around the next era of bio. And, you know, even though there are some really great exits and events from the last year, we're very, very early on. I think the proof of the model exists, the talent and knowledge ecosystems are starting to exist. Tools are getting better, easier to use, cheaper. So, the biggest message is go build in this space and come talk to us. Do not join a Web3 startup.
Any closing thoughts, Zavain?
I have a few Web3 investments. So I won't mirror that exactly, but I will say, we're, to Nan's point, I'll just double down. We're in the bottom of the first inning here, and if we're right, and it's the collective we that I speak of right now, I think we're massively right in a way that's going to be hugely impactful on global health, and then also, of course, lucrative as well. And so I'd really encourage anybody and everybody who's interested in this space, especially the people who already have a little bit of fluency in and across those languages that we discussed earlier, to really double and triple down. And then, as Nan said, if you're building anything, we're always here.
How can our audience learn more about your work? Nan, we've touched on some fun topics and projects you've been up to today. How can they learn more?
I think social media and direct outreach are both welcome. So I'm on Twitter, LinkedIn, and always up for one-on-one chats.
Zavain, same to you?
My live journal is usually the best way to get me, but I'm kidding. No, social media and direct outreach is perfect.
Great. Thank you both once again for joining us. An absolutely fantastic episode. We're very grateful for your time. Thanks again.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having us. This was fun.